Hello, everyone. My name is Bree Coxbill, and this is a court case briefing over Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire in 1942. So here are some facts of the case and the background of all which occurred before the case, during the Supreme Court, the whole deal. It was argued on February 5th, 1942, and decided on March 9th, 1942. The official title of the case is Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, 1942. To give you some background on what sparked this case, a man by the name of Walter Chaplinsky was on a public sidewalk in downtown Rochester handing out literature supporting Jehovah's Witness and other controversial forms of religion at the time. Now, I'm going to say some slanderous words that were cited in the case. If you do not wish to hear these words, you're more than welcome to skip ahead about 10 seconds or so. Chaplinsky spoke the phrases a goddamned racketeer and a damned fascist about the town marshal. He was arrested on the grounds of a New Hampshire law that prohibits offensive, derisive, or annoying speech to any person who is lawfully in a street or public area that can disrupt the peace in that area, and law enforcement can take action. This law is Part C 378-2 of Public Law of New Hampshire, supported by the Supreme Court of the state. To give you some background about what was going on during this time is we first will probably see that the words that were used in slander is probably not what we would consider slanderous in the present day in 2023. But when you really look at history of what was occurring during this time, World War II is progressing. It is ongoing. Industries are changing the country. The way of life for people was transforming at a rapid pace in many different areas. And when we think about World War II, we often think about what was going on during that time, and war is a pretty difficult thing in a country. And in our history classes, we know of one man named Hitler, who was doing some things during that time that many would not agree with, even in the present day, obviously. But the words fascist and racketeer are often referred to as those who are extremely right, swinging as those like Hitler. And so Chaplinsky was using these words to describe the town marshal, saying he was a fascist and a racketeer and that he was corrupt in his ways and just not a great person. And so Chaplinsky was arrested and went through the court. And later, Chaplinsky appealed, arguing his First Amendment was violated due to this New Hampshire law. Other facts, Hayden C. Covington for the appellant. He was for Chaplinsky, and Frank R. Kingston for the appellee in New Hampshire. Those were the two advocates in the case. So the main question of the case is, did Chaplinsky's conviction violate the First Amendment? Chaplinsky appealed, saying that this law in New Hampshire violated his freedom of speech rights. It violated the First Amendment, and so he appealed it to the Supreme Court. Next, we'll talk about the holding. It's pretty straightforward, but we'll talk a little bit about more later in conclusion. The use of fighting words do not hold under the protections of the First Amendment. As you'll see below, this second part is my own words, possible breach of peace due to such fighting words. So Chaplinsky used those fighting words towards the town marshal in a public space, and the Supreme Court decided that fighting words are outside the bounds of the First Amendment, especially when they can breach the peace in a public area. Going on about this, the court reached a unanimous decision for New Hampshire in support. This verdict was once again based on fighting words such as the ones that Chaplinsky used to fall outside of the First Amendment protections. Chaplinsky's insults were viewed as fighting words for causing disruption of peace and harm to other persons. Thus, the court concluded that states could, in fact, use police force to protect order and morality. And to move on with this, it's pretty straightforward, but how does this relate to the First Amendment? Obviously, it's freedom of speech. And the First Amendment protects a variety of speeches, freedom of speech being one of them. This amendment is often abused by people who step outside the bounds in which the original amendment was created for. They step across that line, but where is that line? In some cases, it's pretty vague. But in this case, they decide that words were profane, slanderous, fighting words, or other ideas of expression that can cause harm to others and disrupt peace. Maybe it lacks social values and breaches the ideas and behind the idea of the First Amendment originally do not and are not protected by the First Amendment. And so we'll talk more about this in this next slide. Here are some discussion questions for you to think about. And this first one's pretty straightforward. Did Chaplinsky have the right to say the words he did? We often use slanderous words in the present day towards public officials in public areas. So, what makes Chaplinsky in the right or wrong? And when we often think about this, when you compare 1942 to 2023, it's two totally different worlds. And we see people now in the present day at Capitol Hill protesting and use slanderous words towards people in official office or administration. Does that still apply? Should Chaplinsky been in the right? It was his freedom of speech at the time. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this one. Question two is a little bit outside the bounds of the case. It happens before the case on the day that Chaplinsky took action. So the question is, Chaplinsky was cited to have been handing out controversial religious pamphlets before he used the phrases towards the town marshal. Do you believe there was some form of bias stemming from his being on the sidewalk, or do you believe there were other reasons that led to his arrest besides the use of his profane language? Obviously, like I said before, history during this time, religion is pretty much at the centerfold. There's a lot going on with religion and freedom of speech. And people are pretty heightened with the war going on and the change in the country. Do you believe that Chaplinsky, if in a different time maybe, or if he was not handing out these pamphlets or professing his ideas on the streets, would he have been arrested? Or the use of the profane language was that tipping point that they decided, okay, enough is enough. We need to get this under control because he's causing disruption to the peace. The third question is, do you agree with the court's ruling about profane words being outside the bounds of the First Amendment? It was a unanimous decision for the Supreme Court during this time. Would this stand today in the modern world? Now, still today, it is decided that fighting words, profane words, freedom of expressions that cause disruption to peace, there are several of them that are listed, do not fall in the bounds of the First Amendment, and that the First Amendment is often abused. And do you agree with the court's decision, or do you believe that there's too much power in the state with that law that law enforcement can take action when they believe there's disruption of peace happening? So I would like to hear your thoughts on these discussion questions or discussion questions of your own that you thought of listening to this case. I highly encourage you to go read up on it. It's quite interesting and everything else. If you need any further clarification or have questions, please feel free to send them my way. I will try my best to answer them and find the answers in the case I may not have them. My last slide is my resources that I used. Both are in APA citations. You can see the dates that I retrieved, both articles, and there is the hyperlinks there. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you.